All right, so I'm going to quickly talk about the AP Psych free response questions for the test in May. So just as a reminder, there will be 2 free response questions, and you have 50 minutes total to write both of those. Something to be aware of is that oftentimes questions are divided into multiple sections, so you might see question 1 and it might have like an A and B, and you might see question 2 and it might have A, B, C, or something like that. You also might not have multiple sections, but we just want you to be aware that it might exist. You do have to write in pen. You're going to use blue or black ink only, which means you're going to bring multiple pens. You want to make sure to try to write as legibly as possible and obviously breathe as you're thinking about approaching your FRQs. So when it's time to start the FRQs, what's going to happen is you're going to take your multiple choice section first. When everybody's finished, you'll be provided a small break, and then they'll get you seated again to be ready to work on your FRQs. When it's time to open the FRQ book, what we'd like you to do is read both questions and decide where to start. So it's important to budget your time. We don't want you to take more than 3 or 4 minutes to look over both questions and kind of make a plan for how you might approach them. But in reading both questions and deciding where to start, there's a couple things to keep in mind. First of all, you do not have to write the questions in order. We would really like you to start on the question that you think is easiest or most accessible to you in terms of scoring. When you work on that question, so you'll go to that part of the booklet to work on that question, it's really best to write the parts of the question, if it's broken into parts, or the terms of the question that you know best first. And then you would leave space to come back. So if you're reading question 2, part B, and you know all 3 of those terms really well, then you might go to question 2. You will clearly identify what part you're working on, so you'll put section B, and then you'll begin writing on that section. Then let's say that you find question 1, part A to be the next best. Then you would go back to question 1 and you would start right at part A. You can start to get comfortable with this if you look at sample questions, which I'll show you on the last slide. The idea of kind of like toggling between the 2 different questions. To be honest, it's best if you work on everything you know within one question first, and then you move on to the other question and write everything you know within that next, and then kind of toggle between them. The reason I say that is because once you kind of get in the flow of a question, you hopefully are remembering what that question is asking for. So you're kind of in the mindset to be able to work on it all at that time. So budget your time. Like I said, make sure that you're doing everything you know first. How the scoring works is that each question is worth approximately 16-ish% of your overall test grade. So you want to score points on both. You don't want to just like nail one and then not work on the other one. You basically start at a 0 score, and then every point that you earn is a point toward your total. Maybe they average between 7 and 9 points or something like that. To be honest, you're working to get 3 points, 4 points on each one, and you're going to be in a super comfortable space for scoring. So just keep that in mind. You don't have to know everything, so that's why we really want you to do well on what you do know, and then do your best to finish each question. With that said, it's best to kind of pay attention to clauses, like to the verbs in the questions. Oftentimes they say describe, explain. They've moved into like compare or contrast, or even like explain the relationship between this term and this term. So they really are looking for you to draw a relationship between the 2 then. So just keep that in mind as you're thinking about approaching these questions. Tips for actually writing the questions then. So once you've decided kind of where to start and what you might want to include, and possibly you've underlined keys that you want to remember. For example, it might say, provide an example of the following terms and list whether they will increase or decrease the response. Then you need to make sure that you do that. You don't just provide an example, but you also state the impact, whether it's increasing or decreasing. So really pay attention to the question. With that said, once you get started, you'll never do introductions, conclusions, or transitions. If it is not going to score on the rubric, do not spend time writing it. This is a very scientific writing, which means it's specific. It's full of definitions. It's not flowery. You're not going to put one past a bunch of psych teachers who are grading this. They have a very specific rubric. And in psychology, it's kind of like the less you write, the more you know, depending on what you wrote, I suppose. So get away from like the flowery writing where you think you're going to have like some sort of emotional appeal. That does not work here. Don't restate the question. So if the question is about students at a party or something like that, you're not going to say something like, while the students were at the party, a lot of psychology was happening around them. Nope, that's restating the question. A transition would be saying something like, while assimilation is often a cognitive part of growth, so is accommodation. No, that's a waste of your time. You don't need to transition from one term to the next. You don't need to transition from part A to part B if there are multiple parts, okay? Instead, keep it simple, be specific, use key terms and examples. You will always define every psychology term that you use to the best of your ability. You have to write in complete sentences. They will not score bullet points or outlines or things like that. So just make sure that you write in complete sentences and you clearly label things. Try not to contradict yourself. So oftentimes it might look like you're scoring in one area, but then you have a contradiction where you say the exact opposite at the end. If they see a contradiction, they will not score it. And then again, being specific and using proper terminology. Anytime you can use psych terms, experiments, or names that tie back to the prompt, make sure to do so. Be careful with these prompts, you guys. When you read it, oftentimes it might ask you to come up with an example, and they've given you kind of a scenario. If they've given you a scenario, use only what they've given you in the scenario and come up with an example tied back to that. If they haven't given you a scenario, but instead they've listed a bunch of terms and they want you to come up with examples, then come up with the best, clearest example that you can come up with, the most logical. Don't try to make it more complicated than it is. If there's an example we used in class, if there's a famous experiment or researcher, if you remember one of the studies or videos that we used, be very specific and use those, okay? Anytime you write an example, try to tie it back to the prompt. So you might say, this demonstrates accommodation because, and then you tie it back. I always talk about DEA, define, explain, apply. Define is automatic. You have to do that. Explain is kind of like if you could offer one more sentence to really drive home that you know what you're talking about, you could do that or you could skip it. And then apply is making sure that you are looking at the prompt and looking at what the prompt is asking for. Is it an example? Is it a relationship? Are you creating something? Another phrase that sometimes people use is UDA, which is underline, define, apply. It is a great habit to get in to underline the term when you use it so that if you need to come back to it, you can clearly find it. All right, so what can you do in advance? Obviously, in advance, you're going to practice. We'd like you to familiarize yourself with lots of different FRQs. The link listed at the bottom is a direct link, but also you can Google College Board AP Psych FRQs, and it will come up for you. So you should really look at a variety of FRQs so that the format doesn't throw you off. Additionally, you have access to rubrics. The more that you look at rubrics, the more you can start to anticipate how questions are scored. It's not a great use of your time to write out a bunch of FRQs. However, we have not sat you down and made you write 2 FRQs in 50 minutes all year. So to do it once, especially if you're listening to this today on AP Enrichment Day, I would strongly encourage you to take 2 FRQs. If you're familiar with the ones that I have in the folders, then pick 2 other ones from online and just click on them, time yourself for 50 minutes and just write, and then use the rubrics to score. So today for AP Enrichment Day, I have a variety of items in the folders. I have a practice FRQ. There's 2 FRQs. You can time yourself for 50 minutes. I have the rubric specific to that FRQ. I have 3 samples, A, B, and C, that were written for this FRQ last year. I would recommend that if you use those, you read them and then anticipate what you think the score is. And then you would look at the final score, and that's in another folder. It just tells you what score they got and why they got it. If you can't quite see the writing, I've also listed these on the Canvas page. At the very bottom of my Canvas page would be resources for study today. There's lots of different resources for you guys to use today. So that's kind of, for the most part, it for FRQs. Obviously, we can talk about them more in class, but I think AP Enrichment Day is a great day to familiarize yourself and to practice.